Сайн байцгаана уу хүн үзэгчтэй. Өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Канадын Кюбекийн их сургуулийн энэ Удавэ гэж хотод байдаг. Их сургуулийн профессор ноён R.Carr оролцож байна.
R.Carr, Канадын Кюбекийн их сургуулийн профессор. R.Carr Торонтогийн их сургуулийн боловсрол судлалын сургууль, боловсролын социологийн чиглэлээр докторийн зэрэг орилжээ. Тэрээр ардчиллын боловсрол, иргэншил ба үндэсний үзлийн эсрэг тэмцэх, энх тайван, шударгаас, хэвлэл мэдээллийн ёс зүйн сэдвээр хэд хэдэн ном бичжээ.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jargal.
So, what are you doing in Mongolia now?
We were invited by a colleague, Tungalug, at the All for Education National Civil Society group to give a series of lectures and workshops on global citizenship education, multicultural education, to a group of about 50 educators, civil society leaders, and representatives of government and organizations. I'm here with my colleague and co-chair of our UNESCO chair in democracy, global citizenship and transformative education with Ginette Teze. So we've only been here for 3 days, actually. It was a whirlwind tour, but we spent the last 2 days with the group of about 50 colleagues from Mongolia.
See, obviously Mongolia's young democracy, these values are something that for some countries it takes a couple generations to go deeper and to be part of your value. In this country it's about, we cannot say 30 years, probably 20 years as soon as we start to consciously, drive on. What is your take? How do you see the way the people at these 50 you have been communicating, the way the democracy works here?
Well, we've learned a little bit. I was here for a short visit about 5 years ago for another project, an Education for Democracy project. And so I think there's a lot of similarities with other countries around the world, and I don't think any country has fully achieved a complete democracy. There's a lot of literature and research and constitutions and other movements about democracy, but it's an ongoing project, it's a process. And there's many similar problems around the world, social inequalities, corruption, participation, types of governance, but I think one of our main areas of interest is education, and education, what type of education to prepare people to participate through transformative education, citizenship, social justice. So I think there's a lot of similarities in Mongolia as within other countries. One thing I've noticed in the 5 years since I've been here is that it seems to be there seems to be, at least in Ulaanbaatar, in the center, a bit of an economic boom, an injection, a lot of capital from mining, I guess, royalties. And so I think that there has to be concern about where the wealth is distributed. Healthcare, education, housing. There's environmental issues, of course, and pollution. But about the issue of democracy, I think one of the main issues is participation. How do people participate? And social media, other forms of media literacy. How do people engage? How do they mobilize? How do they influence not only decision making, but social and cultural movements, attitudes, behaviors? So I think education is a key component here in preparing for democracy, education for democracy, and critically engaged citizenship.
Exactly. That's, to me, as a person who is writing about that, exactly, democracy doesn't mean only voting.
No.
It's a participation, conscious participation, based on knowledge. So that requires certain level of development of civic society, isn't it? So those part of people who are more informed, who has more knowledge, are part of a civic society. So how do you see the movement of civic society here And what is their role in strengthening democratic values in the country?
I agree with you. I think that elections are probably the thinnest part of a democracy, and that may sound a bit of a paradox because we put so much energy and emphasis on elections, who gets elected, how they get elected, the media around that, the rules and the regulations, the fundraising, the debates and elections. And so increasingly more and more people are disengaging from formal normative elections around the world. And they don't seem to respond to the needs that people have to eradicate racism, poverty, sexism, major problems, housing and so on, environment. In relation to civil society, I think that's fundamental. How the largest movements, the largest changes that take place usually don't come from government. The Me Too movement, for example, the environmental movement recently, these in civil society are pushing formal decision-making, shaping policy, political debates, formal political debates. Of course, we have to change political systems within and so on. But civil society is key to representing the voices of people who are marginalized, women's groups, traditionally marginalized peoples. And we've spent a bit of time with colleagues here, so we have a bit of an idea. We've heard that there's roughly 1,000 civil society groups, if that's accurate. And I think that it's important that they're able to develop, they're able to have voices, and I think often they develop their own ways, and perhaps you're involved in that too, their own social media, other types of information, other types of engagement outside of these formal networks and processes. But I think the civil society groups are really the fiber of society. I think that the formal side is important, but civil society provides a voice where it often isn't there in the mainstream media, for example. And I think the environment, as we know in Mongolia, there's a mining boom for the last 10, 20 years, and who's going to say something about that? Probably not the government to the level that is required by civil society. People are
saying already on words there. Now people talk about the injustice in distribution of mining wealth, in particular the mining, the commodities, the natural products are not created by somebody, right? It belongs actually to every Mongolians. Yet we understand that those who invested, who made the cost to dig it and process it, sold it, they have need to cover costs, profit, etc. But at the end, what is remaining, people find it is injustice, a lot of injustice. Those who are close to decision making in mining, those who has the mining licenses, have more take. And people are not happy, and in the country we have a growing differences of social layers, society. So what would be your thought in such a country like Mongolia, dependent on mining income? There are many countries, we call it a certain trap, okay, and its course, kind of. In that situation, what is the best way to get people involved?
Yeah, I think that often in economic terms, it's sometimes referred to as the Dutch disease when there's an over-reliance on one commodity, usually oil. But with the emphasis on mining, I think there's many issues at play, and with the exodus from rural areas to the capital each year, I've read 40,000, but perhaps more. They're creating housing issues in and around the outer layer of Ulaanbaatar, people burning coal in their traditional gur tents. There's access to education, to employment. There's transportation issues. With the mining, I think that it's more than an economic issue because there's environmental concerns. What happens with the mining, with the resources that are used to develop the water and so on? What happens afterwards? Do we know about the health concerns? Do we know about, we've had some presentations over the last couple of days from representatives of the Kazakh community and others, and the relationship that people have to the environment. All of these things will be lost or disrupted. And so I think the civil society groups have to be included in the decision-making as to how this takes place, if indeed it will, but also how the resources will be used so that they, if it is indeed sustainable, how it benefits the society. If it's benefiting mainly shareholders who don't live or partake in Mongolian society, then there's going to be terrific and tremendous upheaval and disruption. Social inequalities will increase, poverty and other issues. So I think that civil society has to be part of the equation. So the question is, how does government ensure that they have some sort of representation in understanding and deciding on particular issues?
May I ask, for example, you said in the mining wealth decision-making related to that, civil society has to say all the words. And that starts, for example, in material terms, it starts from the sharing of the royalty from, right, developing that or producing that wealth. Mm-hmm. And, in Canada, that system is rather well developed, and I understand royalty goes not only to the region where they are producing, but also that royalty goes certain part to the non-mineral producing provinces. How does it work?
Mm-hmm. I think that from the outside it may seem very coherent and seamless, but from the inside there's tremendous debate and disruption in Canada over the royalties from the oil, for example, in Alberta, to take as a main example, but there is mining and other natural resource industries. And the question is, apparently I understand, and this could be wrong, but that we have the lowest remittance from royalties in the world for the oil. So a lot of the profits from the oil goes to the United States, primarily, but elsewhere. So, for example, the average Canadian doesn't see that, for example, at the gas pump, something very tangible, that the gas is inexpensive. No, it doesn't go down at all. In fact, it's very expensive. It's almost roughly twice the cost as it is in the United States. So the royalties, there are taxes that relate to the revenue, and there are jobs that are produced, but the bitumen, they call it the tar sands in Alberta, there's a lot of issues about Indigenous peoples being displaced, high cancer rates, use of water and other resources to extricate the oil, and also there's debates about pipelines. And pipelines are not fail-proof. They're not 100% safe. So when a pipeline explodes, or there's problems also with trains, Lac Mégantic in Quebec, there was a train that exploded with all of the oil on it. So extracting it is an issue, but then also sending it, transporting it's an issue. And also, the usage of it. So there are debates that we should use our own oil rather than importing it. And also for the environment, it's not good. So how do we even extricate ourselves from these things? So in a nutshell, I'm not sure if Canada's a good model for the royalties.
Do you import still?
There's some oil that's imported because it's a very large country.
It's closer, so economically has sense.
And there aren't refineries all over the place.
Second largest country in the world,
that's
after
right.
Russia.
A very large country, but the population is highly concentrated along the Canadian border, and it's only roughly 36 million people.
Yes.
But I think that the oil too, as I mentioned, this bitumen is dirty oil, and so it takes a lot of processing, and this is why there's proposals to have it sent via pipelines, the United States and Canada, and also to the British Columbia coast, to have it sent to China.
So Canada has own problems, also
Yes.
with participation, also with the indigenous people.
Yes.
Their involvement in the society, etc. So the issues of democracy, in particular, their problems are kind of global issues.
That's
everywhere, right?
There's no one country that can say it's fully resolved all the issues.
Yeah, until now we have been seeing the U.S. one of the shining model, and which is not the case anymore. So just, my concern is people also see that share here in Mongolia, and the only thing is, living standard is still poor. As you said, 1/3 of the country is poor. Half of Ulaanbaatar lives in the scared districts without proper sanitation. So that is a big concern. And we see democracy as a only tools, by the way, that these people can come and say that that's what we don't want, that's what we want. This is the way we want to improve our life. And there's no other means. We had not that means before, during the communist time. You know, the communist leaders know, the party leaders know more than you, so they even don't care. So in that circumstances, in Mongolia, we try to really convince people that this is the best tool. However, when in particular it's a former socialist country where everybody was poor, not that poor as now, and equal, you see, more or less. Everybody had shelter, food enough. Okay, not that rich, but the whole distribution system was, everybody had, as now, they have access to education, etc. So that's what we are struggling with now, like many post-communist countries. How do you see, in general, the trend in post-communist countries? We were talking about the injustice being a threat to the values of democracy.
Well, I think that we have to make a distinction between the notion of democracy, the theory, the philosophy of democracy, and what we're seeing as these operational systems. And I would call what you're describing here and elsewhere as normative, representative, hegemonic democracy. The fact that people can write something on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, or that people can go in the street and say something, doesn't mean that we have democracy. You've just elucidated very clearly that under the Soviet regime, people went to school, they had healthcare, they had housing, and they had some standard of living. Now, there were other issues, of course, that weren't as desirable, and now people, under democracy, the notion was that everyone would somehow benefit from all of these massive gains in technology and trade and the freedom, the unleashing of the economy. But what's happened around the world, and we can see that social inequalities are increasing. And I think that in Eastern Europe, that's generally the case, that we see a kind of a net exodus, people leaving. There aren't people coming in, but there's people leaving. And I think one of the big concerns right now around the world is the increasing tendency towards xenophobia. And when you would think this would be entirely incompatible with democracy. So this is why I say that we've got normative, representative, hegemonic democracy, and not kind of a functioning, critically engaged, participant-based democracy. It's elite-run and oligarchies, and I think that the elections are really controlled, and often they're kind of an endpoint. It's not a full-out engagement. Without broad-based education, not just formal, but informal and non-formal, it's very hard to cultivate a lot of the levels of resistance we need. For example, in Canada, the conditions for Aboriginal peoples in general, but specifically in certain areas, to say to people that some are fighting for potable water, housing, there's discrimination, unemployment, there really isn't a movement for reconciliation that's really critically embedded amongst a lot of people with Aboriginal peoples, this is pretty horrifying to
So having
accept.
seen all this in Canada, in Mongolia, and other obviously post-communist countries, you are the UNESCO. What do you do in UNESCO?
Actually, we have a UNESCO chair in democracy, global citizenship, and transformative education. We're not with UNESCO, but UNESCO chairs, there are 27 in Canada, roughly 700 around the world, and essentially we're sponsored and supported by our universities. We're part of a UNESCO network. We do research, we engage with civil society and with the South, the global South, but we also adhere to UNESCO priorities and values in relation to, for example, human rights and democracy and so on. So we engage in research and engagement that way. We're not funded by UNESCO, so I'm not a representative of UNESCO per se.
However, UNESCO has this network. All these values are somehow simultaneously, through this networking, coming all around to every country in particular. You said the South, which is, I think, it's very applaudable steps. And just I'm trying to figure out, you have seen all these countries, you have a network. What is the best way to have that education of democracy to people? Have you made any kind of experiment or any kind of ranking of the ways we can have people more educated, a different broad society?
I think that a central focus needs to be education, formal education, lowering the volume on all these tests and evaluations, putting more of a focus on critical engagement, social justice, democracy, citizenship. So doing democracy, to do it, to do democracy, you have to do it, and to cultivate democracy, to open up the curriculum, to have more and more critical experiences with society, to involve civil society in schools, to make the curriculum and the educational experience more aligned with bona fide, meaningful, and, critically engaged issues in society, involving different people, involving different contexts, being open and respectful and working towards peace, but having a real sense of the diversity of issues around the world. And I think that the environment is a key issue. We have to go beyond recycling and look at some of the major causes. We can stop warfare, which is not good for the environment. We can stop overconsumption. We can try to reduce social inequalities and poverty. We can distribute food. We can work in solidarity.
Those actions itself, involving the people, means democracy, isn't it?
Yeah. So by doing democracy and opening up the door so that people can actually engage in this way.
Can we talk about that curriculum in schools? What would be the best cases, if you may know, would be which grades and which format it can go so that the children, as much as possible, early stage of their age, understand that democracy is the way we live. There's no other way.
Well, I think we have to move beyond the mantra and the chant that democracy is good, communism is bad. It's not bipolar. It's what we actually do as human beings. So I think that it has to be infused in all grades, all schools, throughout the institutional culture, the hallways, the recreation yards, the lunchrooms, with parents. And we have to rethink what we're doing and what's education for. It can't be just for getting a job. That's the antithesis of building some sort of meaningful citizenship. We have to also reconsider teachers and educators, the way that they are supported, trained, allowing them to evolve and to be creative, more creative. when we think of social media, what's going on, people are producing and consuming, and they're developing videos and memes and networks and groups, and it's going way beyond this normal concept of a small classroom. And also educators, I think we have to consider, we're having teacher shortages in a lot of countries. People aren't going into teaching. There are many reasons. I think we have to look at salaries, the values, the support. And I think we want to consider as well leadership, epistemology, inclusion, all of the dynamics that come into the school experience. It's not just one class, it's not just one technique, but I think we really have to resist the temptation to think of democracy in terms of elections. So we have to teach how we can work together, how we can think together, and there's many examples that we can find. I mean, we can develop parks, we can have community gardens, we can have what Paulo Freire called generative themes, where students can bring in ideas from their own areas. Mm-hmm. Of course, if you're living in a gur on the outside of town, that's not the same as living in a condo in the middle of... So how do we connect people too? And how do we share these issues and problems? And I think that one thing is that we could consider not having schools graduate individually, but they have to work together so that it's a community social project.
Mm-hmm. You are very much broadening the aspect we see under the concept of education for democracy. That's more communication, more networking, more creativity, etc. So I don't know when we will start to see it in that way, in a broader aspect. But nevertheless, we try in Mongolia. And there was even a certain curriculum about mm-hmm. democracy, under which they were talking about human rights, also freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And then somehow it stopped, the political parties come and they change, and the kids at the end becoming kind of experimental mm-hmm. with all these things. And what you are talking about, and particularly you have been working with 50 civic society representatives, would be good, another step towards better democracy, better life in this country. So I would like to thank you for coming to Mongolia and sharing your knowledge with us on this, our program.
Thank you so much, Jargal.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
За хүндэтгэгчдээ өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Канадын Кюбекийн их сургууль, гэхдээ Удавэ гэж хотод байдаг. Энэ сургуулийн профессор ноён R.Carr оролцлоо. Баярлалаа.